All right, folks. So today we are talking about Chapter 9 political parties. I know my last couple of videos have been a little on the shorter side, and I'm going to try and keep this one under an hour, but this one tends to go right around an hour, maybe a smidge over. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. When we're talking about political parties, we are talking about the organization that runs people for office. So what it really is a group of people with similar interests that have similar desires and visions for our country who work together to create and implement policies. So their goal is to run a candidate for office under their party name. Once that candidate is elected into office, then they are going to use that candidate to try and ensure that their policies and their goals are implemented into our government itself. So political parties want to control our government and what our government does. So again, they're going to run a candidate for public office under their party's name. So they're going to find a suitable candidate that can be elected. They are going to organize and centralize power, which is really interesting because we look back to our founding fathers. One of the biggest concerns was their founding fathers didn't want all the power centralized at one level of the government or with one group even. They thought that if we got to a situation where one level was too powerful or one group controlled everything, then that would be the demise of our democracy. Democracy again is where we all participate, we all vote, and we all have an opportunity to express conflicting opinions. And our government is supposed to be responsive to us because we delegate that power to it. So political parties are not what our founding fathers envisioned them to be, whereas they're now able to actually control our government. What we've seen is that the structure of our government with these multiple layers of government, the federal government and the state governments and then the local governments, has actually created a need for these political parties because they needed to be able to centralize power within the government, different levels of government, and elect officials that were going to be loyal to each other to actually accomplish the party platforms and the party goals themselves. So political parties have four main functions. The first one is they do what we call contest elections, which means that they're going to organize public opinion. They're going to they're going to organize public opinion and organize voters. And then they're going to select a candidate to run for office. They're going to have their candidates or their supporters vote for that candidate to get them into office. Typically, when they're contesting elections, they are expressing policy positions on important issues that voters are going to be concerned about. We see that the political parties organize public opinion. So they are the limited channel of communication that the political parties have to, and the candidates a lot of times have to communicate with their supporters. We see that voters will approve of how our particular parties are operating or not approved by voting for them or not voting for their candidates in elections. Political parties are going to build coalitions. So they might take two different groups that have, their interests are not the same, but they're able to convince those two groups to sort of join together. There's power in number, there's strength in numbers. So say, for example, a group that is concerned about the environment and then a group that is concerned about employment practices. They might convince them, say, hey, you support the party that wants to reduce waste and reduce greenhouse emissions, and they're going to support you in when you're trying to ask for better working hours, better conditions, and those sorts of things. Now, finally, the fourth function of the party that we see is that they adopt policy changes from smaller political parties. So essentially, when we have a third party that comes up with a great idea that seems to be getting a lot of traction with the American public and voters are really excited about the ideas of this party, we'll see one of the two main parties come in and co-opt those ideas, sort of claim them as their own to try and pull those voters away from the third party back to one of the major two parties. Okay, let's review question number one. What were those four functions of a party that we just discussed? Oops, not that one. All right. Okay, so when we're looking at elections, we have three types of elections. We have what we call a maintaining election, and a maintaining election is essentially that the political party continues to keep the power. So we see this when a politician is reelected For example, when Barack Obama was elected initially in 2008 and then reelected in 2012, that would have been a maintaining election because the Democrats kept control of the government. Deviating elections are when there was a temporary shift in public support for the parties. So we see this happening when one party gets elected, and then the next election year, the other party gets elected, and then the next year, another party gets elected. Now, realigning elections are different from deviating elections because deviating elections are only temporary. It's a temporary shift in power. A realigning election shows a permanent shift in power from one political party to another. So if we look at the Clinton versus Trump election in 2016, that would be considered a deviating election. It was where Hillary Clinton, Hillary Clinton was going against Donald Trump, the Democrat versus the Republican, and then Trump, the Republican, won. So had it been Hillary Clinton winning, then that would have been a maintaining election because it would have been the third election in a row that we had a Democratic candidate for president. It's considered a deviating election simply because it wasn't a permanent shift. Had Donald Trump been reelected in 2020, then it would have been considered a realigning election where there was a permanent shift in what the public wanted. But since Donald Trump was only a one-term president, it was a temporary shift or a deviating election. Okay, so if we look at the political parties themselves, there's different parts of our political parties. We have the party and the electorate, and the party and the electorate is essentially everyone who considers themselves to be loyal to that party. The easiest way to find the party and electorate is to look at who's a registered member of that party. So when you go to register to vote, they'll ask you which party you want to belong to. If you self-identify as a member of a Democrat or Republican or maybe an independent party, you're considered party in that electorate. We like the party in the electorate because we know that they are more likely to vote for the candidate and they are more likely to contribute financially to that candidate as well. What we see is that it isn't only the individuals who have self-identified as a member of a party that are considered the party in the electorate. Some people might consider themselves to be Republican or Democrat without ever actually having registered, and they continue to vote and support that candidate. So part of the electorate is going to be everyone who has self-identified as a member of the party, but also the people that consider themselves to be part of that party. All right, let's review question number 2. Who are the party and the electorate? All right. All right. Okay. So from there, we have the party organization. The party organization is all the active members of the party that are responsible for coordinating the party behavior. So these are going to be the committees. At the top level, we have the national committee and chair, and they're the ones that coordinate our national party convention. If we go down chain of command, we have the state committees and chair. They're in charge of the state party conventions. Down from there, we have the county committees and chairs who are in charge of the county elections, and then the precinct committees and chairs that are in charge of the local elections in the precincts. All right, so historically, what we've seen is American parties were weak national organizations. So at the top of that chart, the national committee, the state committee, they were generally the weaker part of the committee or the parties themselves. The local political organizations at the very bottom, at the precinct, at the county level, were much stronger because they were able to reach out to the voters directly as opposed to a national party. What we've seen, though, is most local parties have very few resources. They don't have the same amount of funding. They don't have the same amount of clout as the national parties do. And these parties, what we see is they revive around elections, and they generally are putting for selecting their candidates at their levels and supporting them for the office. During non-election years, the party that is not in office is going to be out going around to like county fairs, to local events, trying to remind voters that they're still in existence. They're going to be putting out press releases talking about what the current party is doing in power and how they would handle it differently. We see that the party in power doesn't necessarily always have more power, but it does appear that way. Because it's generally the public official as opposed to the party that's exercising power at those local levels. The state parties are generally a little stronger than the local parties. because they're going to have more connections to the national party. State parties we see generally have professional staff on board that are paid a salary from the party. They're able to get more fundraising from the national committee. The national committee is more likely to give them funding to run their candidates. And we see that patronage a lot of times within the state level helps to grease the wheels of the state party activities and get them more exposure. Now, if we look at this typical state party organization, again, the size-wise, we have the state committees up top, the congressional district committees below that, the county committees, the intermediate committees, the ward committees, and then the local committees themselves. At the national party organization, each party is going to be governed by a national committee, and that national committee is going to have representatives from each state party organization and from other party groups, and they're going to have a highly paid, highly skilled professional staff supporting them. Their committees are going to be led by a national chairperson who's unofficially chosen by the party's presidential nominee every 4 years, unofficially appointed by the presidential nominee, and then confirmed at the national convention to lead the role of chairperson. When the president leads the national party organization, it's going to be dominated by the White House, and the White House is going to use, or the national party is going to use the White House as an instrument for promoting the president and promoting his reelection. If the party that's not in power is going to have more of their own professional staff performing the same things. So what they're doing is they're preparing themselves for the national convention. So every 4 years in the summer before the presidential election, so summer 2024, we have each party holds their own national convention. Now the convention is going to be attended by the delegates at each state send. So the states are going to choose a delegate and send them to represent the state. At that national convention, they are going to adopt a party platform. Now the party platform, the main goal of the party platform is to emphasize why this party is different from the other party and why it's better than the other party. So we're going to see that these conventions will generally pull out a party platform that's going to deal with things like environmental issues. It's going to deal with things like healthcare, immigration. It's going to deal with things like political reforms and those sorts of things. And they're going to come out and say, this is how we feel on abortion. This is how the other party feels. This is what we think should happen with oil drilling. This is what the other party believes, to try and attract as many voters to that party as possible. What we see is these party platforms are generally pretty accurate. Once their candidate gets elected into office, generally the candidate is able to fulfill most of those party platforms. So it's important when we're looking at the party platforms of the different parties to really take a good look at them and see, do our values align with them? Is this what I want? Because the odds are that's what's going to happen if that particular candidate does get elected. What we've seen is the vast majority of our delegates are now chosen by our voters in primary elections. But with states that have caucuses, they generally open them up to all voters as opposed to just closing the elections to try and elect the party's presidential nominee. Now, at the convention, the delegates are going to vote not only on the party platform, but they're also going to vote on the president and the vice presidential nominees for their particular party. Typically, the president or the presidential nominee prior to the national convention will select who he wants to be their running mate or their vice president. And then they will go from there. And at the national convention, the vice president is simply confirmed at the same time as the presidential nominee. Now, the main goal of the selection of the vice presidential candidate is to improve the chances of winning the election. So what we see a lot of times is they try and do what we call balance the ticket. We saw this with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Joe Biden is older, obviously, a white man. And so we saw them balance out Joe Biden with Kamala Harris, who is a female. She is, biracial, Jamaican, African-American, and young. So voters that looked at Joe Biden and thought, I don't know, he's very white and he's very old. Once they attached Kamala Harris to him, thought, okay, she balances him out because, she's a woman of color and she's a female, and she's a lot younger. We saw the same thing happen with Donald Trump and Mike Pence. Donald Trump was new to the political scene. He's never held public office, or he never held public office before his election in 2016. So he didn't really know the ins and outs of Congress or how the government runs. They balanced him out with Mike Pence, who was a longtime congressperson who was very experienced in our government, had lots of connections in Congress, and knew how to get things done. So they're able to balance out Trump's inexperience with Pence's vast knowledge of our government to try and present a candidate that the American public would vote for. All right. So we also have our party and government. And the party and government are going to be all the elected or appointed members of the party. So when we're voting for our congressional representatives, those are the party and government. When they are appointing people to head the cabinet departments in different positions or in the different agencies within the bureaucracy, those are going to be the party and the government. All right. So how do these candidates accomplish their goals? How do the political parties accomplish their goals of getting candidates put into place to control our government? What we see is they do a ton of fundraising. Fundraising is going to happen to support the candidates through their campaigns. Campaigns have become increasingly expensive and cost prohibitive. They are going to use candidates, or they're going to use the fundraising to ensure that the candidates stay loyal to the party. They're going to say, okay, we will give you this much money for your war chest for your campaign, but you have to agree to support our platform and push our policy issues through. And they also use that fundraising to reach out and register potential voters. Those get out the vote campaigns, those are out there to try and get voters who will vote for that political party to register to vote and then show up on election day. All right. The candidates, in addition to, so the political parties themselves raise money for the candidates and for the political party. And then the candidates are also going to be doing fundraising themselves for their own campaigns. Outside groups we see are raising more money than ever, trying to impact these elections. So you might have a group that's not the political party, that's not the candidate, but supports the candidate, who's then going to go out and raise money to try and increase more money for more exposure for that particular candidate. Typically what we see is the candidate that spends the most money is the one that wins the election. In 2016, when Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton, that proved to not be true. Hillary Clinton spent $564 million trying to become president in 2016, whereas Donald Trump spent only $333 million, which is still a ton of money. It's thought that Donald Trump was able, first of all, Hillary Clinton was seen as very polarizing. She wasn't really popular among certain populations. But Donald Trump also had a ton of name recognition. He was known for his reality TV show, The Apprentice. He's been featured in magazines all over. So he had a lot of name recognition coming in, which might account for part of the reason why he was able to spend less and still get elected. All right. So with the large increase in fundraising and spending by the political parties, there's a huge concern in terms of democracy, because if there are particular groups or organizations or even individuals that are contributing heavily to one candidate or another, it's thought that they are doing with an expectation that they will get some sort of benefit once that candidate gets elected. And if we have a presidential or even congressional or state level candidates that are now beholden to other interests, it makes us question whether or not will they make decisions based upon what's good for the United States as a whole, or are they going to make decisions that are based upon what's good for their particular donors and supporters. So we've seen the government come in at various times to try and limit the amount of influence any one individual or group can have over a particular candidate. So there's contribution limits for every election. For the 2024 election, here are the limits that we see. So if you're an individual, you can give to the candidate committee, so to the candidate themselves. You can give to a public action committee, which is a group that is not connected to the candidate, but supports the candidate. So they can't coordinate behind the scenes, like we're going to take this much money and run this ad, and you run your ad. And they just have to be completely separate, but they still support the candidate. They can give to the party committees, so the state, district, or local committees. They can give to the national committee. And then they can also give to other national party committee accounts. So an individual can give $3,300 per election to the candidate. They can give $5,000 to the PAC, $10,000 to the party committees, $41,300 to the national committee, and then a total of $123,900 per account per year to the additional national committees. So when we add those numbers up, we still see where an individual can give close to $200,000 to support a particular candidate and a particular party. If we go down, we see that there's limits on how much the candidate committee can then give, the PACs can give, multi-party, national party committee, so forth and so forth. The party national committee is able to give $5,000 per election to the candidate committee. The PACs, they can give $5,000 to the PAC, or they can receive $5,000 from the PACs. There's unlimited transfers between the national committee and the party committee, so money can go back and forth freely. And between the party national committee, there is unlimited transfers within themselves. So if we look at this, we see that different groups can give different amounts to our electoral candidates to try and support those candidates, but also to try and influence the elections. If we take a look at the last 2020 presidential election, and we look at the amount of spending that happened, the blue line is presidential spending, whereas the green is congressional spending. Total money that was spent was over $14 billion. Of the two presidential nominees, Donald Trump and Joe Biden raised $1.064 billion. Trump raised $784 million. So a ton of money being raised. Total presidential spending on top of what was raised, because remember, the national committees and other groups can contribute to the presidential campaigns. It came in just under $6 billion total being spent at the national level. And then at the congressional level, we're looking at, over, almost $8 billion being spent on these campaigns. So if we're seeing this much money being spent, but we know that the presidential candidates combined raised less than $2 billion, that means that the rest of this money, basically $12 billion, is coming from outside sources. If we look at the midterm, here we go. So this is how much the Democrats outspent the Republicans in the 2020 election. The blue is the Democrats, the reds are the Republicans. And remember, again, typically the party that spends the most wins the election. And we saw that happen in 2020 with Democrats spending, about $8.5 billion on the presidential election and the congressional elections, with the Republicans spending, about a little bit less than the Democrats, which about $5.3 billion. Okay, so if we take a look at the 2022 midterm elections between the House and the Senate, we see that the amount raised, the amount spent between the Democrats and Republicans in the House pretty much stayed consistent. They were, in terms of total, in terms of total spent, they were pretty close to each other. The total raised was $982 million for the Democrats, $940 million for the Republicans. Total spent, the Democrats spent almost all of that, $980,000. Republicans spent $881 million. So pretty close. In the Senate, we saw that the Democrats spent more in the Senate than the Republicans did. With the Democrats raising about $954 million, Democrats coming in less than that, $746 million. And then we saw that in terms of spending, again, the Democrats spent more with $897, and Republicans spent about $743. So your book talks about Campbell's surge and decline theory, and I wanted to take a moment just to touch on this. So what Campbell's surge and decline theory is that during a presidential election, the voters are excited, they're mobilized, and they show up in larger numbers to vote for the presidential candidate. But then in the midterm elections, those elections that happen between election years, presidential election years, we're voting on state and local governments, we're voting on our Congress people. People aren't as mobilized, they're not as excited. So typically, whichever party wins the presidential election will generally lose voters for the midterm elections and lose seats in Congress because voters aren't as mobilized or not as excited to vote. So if we look at the election in 2020, we see that 67% of those who voted for Joe Biden also showed up and voted in the 2022 midterm election versus Trump voters, 71% of those showed up and voted in the midterm elections. So that reinforces Campbell's surge and decline theory. If we look at, Trump lost the election, Biden won, but then we saw, Republican supporters show up more in the midterm elections in 2022. All right, so what we have here in the United States is what we call the two-party system. The two-party system is where we have two main political parties. Other countries have a one-party system where it's simply a single party monopolizes the organization of power and all the positions of authority within that government. So we're going to see in those types of governments, it's not generally aren't democracies. It's generally one ruling party or one individual controlling the government. States or countries that have multi-party systems also exist in the United States. Obviously, we have the Democrats and Republicans, the two main ones, but other countries have more than two political parties that compete to hold office. What we see in the United States is our political process, our systems, our structures are set up really to promote that two-party system. One of the main reasons is we have the historic dualism of American public conflicts. So it's generally, you either support it or you don't. There's very little gray in between. So either you support reducing greenhouse emissions or you don't, right? You support a woman's right to choose or you don't. You support increasing immigration or increasing immigration or you don't. So because there's usually just a yes or a no or a pro or a con, the candidate for our voters, we're usually looking at one of the two candidates because they usually take opposing views. When we look at the views of the American voters, we see that most American voters are very moderate, meaning they're very in the middle. It's very rare that you find an American voter that's all in for the Republicans or all in for the Democrats. Most voters agree with some of what each of the parties say. And so they're just sort of in the middle on that political spectrum, which means that if they're in the middle, they're going to either vote for one side or the other. When we look at the structure of our electoral system, how we have plurality voting, it actually encourages the dominance of the two-party system. And then remember that fourth function of the party where they talked about where they adopt the policy issues of the smaller parties, that encourages the two-party system because if they are able to adopt those issues as their own, then the voters will come to one of the two main political parties and not vote for the third party itself. So in the United States, we have a winner-take-all party, or winner-take-all rules, which means that the winner of that state's election, with the exception of two states, get all the votes. So winner-take-all rules means here in California, we have 55 electoral college votes in 2020. Of those 55 electoral college votes, instead of them being allocated for this percentage for Biden and this percentage for Trump, Biden got everything because he got the majority in our state, which means he got all of our votes. So if we're at a situation where whoever gets the most votes gets all the votes, we're never going to see a third party become viable because a third party is probably not going to be able to get a majority of the votes in a state. They might get a chunk of votes, but generally they won't qualify for a majority of the votes in the states. We have the idea of strategic voting and wasted vote theory, where an individual might actually agree more with a third party, but realize that third party candidate isn't viable. There's no way that candidate can win the election. And because they don't want to waste their vote on someone who's not going to win, they will then cast their vote for one of the two main parties because they know that they have a better chance of actually being able to select a candidate who would actually win. Because these third parties aren't seen as viable, they can't get the majority of the vote in the states, voters are going to choose not to vote for them because they want to make sure that whoever they're voting for is the winning party or a viable party. Because there aren't a lot of voter support for these third parties, then third parties get discouraged from being created or from enduring because they can't get enough support, they can't get enough voters, they can't get enough funding, then they're sort of spinning their wheels and never accomplishing their goals. So from there, we see fewer third parties, which then perpetuates the two-party system. And we're right back to where we were before, where we have two main parties and voters are choosing between the two of them. All right. So the question, though, is always, do the two parties have a future? Is there ever going to be a situation or a time when a third party candidate can get enough support to win a presidential or a national election here in the United States? And I would argue that we're not that far off. So if you look at this chart, it goes all the way back to February of 2022 up until March of 2024. And what they did was they asked individuals, do you consider yourself to be a Republican, a Democrat, or do you feel like you are independent? And if we look at 2024, March of 2024, 30% said they felt like they associated with the Republicans, 28% said Democrats, and then independents were 41%. So if these numbers are a fairly accurate representation of how people in the United States feel, that means 40% or 2 out of 5 doesn't consider themselves either a Republican or a Democrat. So if 2 out of 5 don't align with the Democrats or the Republicans, that means that the independents, if a third party candidate were able to get all 41% of those independents to vote for them, they would get the most votes and could possibly win a national election. These numbers have stayed pretty much the same. If we go back to March of 2023, Republicans had 25%, Democrats were at 25%, and independents were at 49%. So almost half of our country felt like they were independent. If we go back to March of 2022, 28% were Republican, 30% Democrat, and 40% independents. But still, when we look at this, we can see that there are more people that don't agree with the Democrats and Republicans than do. And this, again, it's the moderates, the ones in the middle that agree with a little bit from each party. So what we see the two main party doings is they're trying to form coalitions with these independent parties to try and bolster their chances of winning the election. All right. So how can we fix this? How can we encourage more political parties? If we want, which I think is a good idea, if we want more than 2 political parties running our country, how do we get that to happen? So other countries have figured out a couple of ways to get this done. One of them is proportional representation. And so what proportional representation looks like is we pick a party. We don't pick a particular candidate, and then that party gets to allocate the number of candidate or winners into their office. So it concentrates the power in the party. But if we're picking based on proportional representation, let's say we've got Democrats, we've got Republicans, and we've got Kanye West's party, the Happy Birthday Party. If we're doing proportional representation and those are the 3 candidates on the ballot, and let's say Democrats get 40%, Republicans get 40%, and then the Happy Birthday Party gets 20%, and there's 100 seats up for grabs. Then Democrats would get 40 seats, Republicans would get 40 seats, and the Happy Birthday Party would get those other 20 seats. So it's a way to ensure that these smaller third parties have an opportunity to have their voices heard and be represented in our government. All right. Majoritarian voting is another way we could try and encourage third-party candidates. So under majoritarian voting, the one who wins is the one that gets 50% or more of the votes. So if we look at those numbers that we just talked about in terms of what political party Americans affiliate with, 40% were independent. So if we had a situation where we had, again, the Democrats, the Republicans, and the Happy Birthday Party, and let's say that 40% was going to go for the Happy Birthday Party, then we would have the Happy Birthday Party, and then whichever one of the Democrats or Republicans, let's say the Republicans get, Happy Birthday Party gets 40%, Republicans get 35%, and then the Democrats get, I think, 25%. So then there would be a runoff between the Happy Birthday Party and the Republicans, the 2 highest vote getters, and then we would decide from there. But because we're breaking it up, there's a chance that that third party could actually get enough votes to be in that final running. And then the final way that I would say that we could encourage more political parties is if we were able to eliminate gerrymandering within our country. So question number 3, how can we encourage more political parties? We just talked about 3 ways, but let's take a look at that third way, redistricting. So redistricting is the act of drawing the district lines. And remember, the voters were voting out of our districts for our electoral college representatives, for our local representatives, for our Congress people. So these districts elect our federal legislators, our state legislators, and most of our local legislators. So we're electing individuals that are making decisions on our behalf. So districts are drawn by geographical territory. So like Illinois is going to have their districts, California is going to have their districts. What we've seen is that the states themselves are the ones that get to draw these district lines. So the Constitution, that 10th Amendment, the reserved powers, reserve the ability to draw these district lines to the states. And so the states have the ability to decide how they're going to draw them. Most states at this point in time will draw the lines to try and ensure that whichever political party is currently in power maintains their power. So remember, we talked about census taking at the very beginning of the semester and how every 10 years, based upon population, states are allocated a certain number of representatives in the House of Representatives. And then once they have those numbers, they redraw their districts to try and make sure that they've got a district for each member that they're allowed to have. So that power remains with the states. And let me show you how this works. So if you want to steal, we call it stealing an election, but if you are the party in power in your state and you want to make sure that you maintain power, this is how you do it. So we've got the red, it's called the red party and the blue party, right? So we're looking at this first box over here. We've got 40% are red, 60% are blue. So if we're going to draw these district lines, we have a couple of options. Remember, we have the ability to do them however we want. So let's say we just wanted to be fair and divvy them up, 10 voters per district. And we just drew lines straight across. What we see here is we draw the line straight across, then the blue party has a majority in all 5 districts. So we can predict that the blue candidate is going to continue to win these elections because they were able to draw the lines to ensure that the blue party has dominance. Now, let's say the red party is in charge, and so they now want to draw these lines to ensure that they have more seats in the next election. So what they can do is they can kind of like, gerrymander it essentially, and they draw like a T here. But if you look at this T, it's got 10 people in it, but 6 of them are red and 4 of them are blue. And they're going to draw this Y, or this goalpost over here. Same thing, 6 red, 4 blue. Another T down here, 6 red, 4 blue. And then these other districts that they're drawing kind of these wonky lines around are just going to be all blue. But by putting all blue in 2 districts, they were able to get a majority red in these other 3. So instead of it being 5 districts are blue, we've got 3 districts are red and 2 are blue. If we look at the number over here, 60% blue and 40% red, it would make sense that they would have 3 blue and 2 red representatives, because that would be proportional to what we have here. I know I don't do a great job of explaining gerrymandering, so I wanted to really quickly show you this video. Let me see. Let me get out of here. Where did it go? Okay. There's this YouTube video. It's pretty quick. It's a little loud, but it does a much better job of explaining gerrymandering 90s. So we're just going to take a quick look at this.
So you pick your toppings, just like when you vote, you pick who represents you. But what if politicians could handpick voters to rig the election in their favor? It's called gerrymandering. It's so rampant that in 86% of elections for the U.S. House, voters have virtually no voice in the election at all. Imagine this pizza is a state that gets 4 representatives in the U.S. House. It has an equal amount of people that support pepperoni and olives. If the whole state voted, you get 2 pepperoni reps and 2 olive reps in the U.S. House. But usually that's not how it works. With gerrymandering, politicians can pick who's in power before the election even starts. For example, if the Olive Party was in charge of drawing the districts, they can make it so all of the pepperoni voters are packed into 1 district. Now the Olives get 3 or 4 districts, even though they only won half the vote. That's some greasy pizza. Or if they're hell-bent on protecting their party's interests, they can split up the pepperonis carefully, despite representing half the population. Arrivederci, pepperoni lovers. These days, shady politicians aren't just drawing districts on the back of a napkin. Using advanced technology and the latest voting data, they can slice districts block by block with precision to rig the districts long before you head to the polls. Oh yeah, and the districts end up looking like Maryland's 3rd district, Louisiana's 2nd district, and Texas's 4th district. Bon appetito. Today, we're in a once-in-a-decade moment. Politicians across the country are drawing the new district lines, determined to erase your voice for the next 10 years while insulating themselves. But you can act now. Call your legislator or learn more at represent.us. Tell them Manny's cousin's nephew's uncle's brother Jerry sent you.
All right, we're gonna stop there because the credit is to a alcohol company and we're not encouraging drinking. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint. All right. Okay, so hopefully that gave you a little better idea of how gerrymandering works. So let's talk about gerrymandering and the Supreme Court. So the issue of gerrymandering has been brought to the Supreme Court time and time again. And the Supreme Court has taken a look at it and they've said, basically, gerrymandering is okay, that the Constitution is silent as to whether or not gerrymandering will be allowed. And so it's a power that's reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment. So each state gets to decide whether or not they want to allow gerrymandering within their state. They've put limits on gerrymandering, though, to try and ensure that the elections are sort of fair. One of the things that they have said is that you cannot have racial gerrymandering. So they can't draw these district lines trying to isolate African Americans or Latinos or Asian Americans. If the court finds out or realizes that they've taken race into consideration on this gerrymandering, then they are not going to allow those district lines to be used and they'll require them to redraw them. They've said that districts must have roughly the same population. So obviously it's not going to always be an exact number, but the numbers have to be about the same. So you can't take all of the African Americans in a state and put them into one district and then have 5 white districts where the population of one district of African Americans is, say, 5 million, and then the other districts all have 1 million each. That's not going to be allowed because that's not fair. And finally, they said partisan gerrymandering is okay. So the idea that the Democrats can come in and draw these district lines to ensure that Democrats get reelected or Republicans can do that, the Supreme Court said that's okay. We're going to allow that. And in a case that happened this year in 2024, there was a case where district lines were drawn on a partisan basis where they said, yeah, we drew them to try and ensure our political party was going to be reelected. When they looked at the results of that gerrymandering, though, they saw that African American voters were being disenfranchised. The way they drew the lines meant that the voices of the African American voters were going to be diluted, that they wouldn't be able to control the number of districts that were proportional to their population. Supreme Court took a look at that and said, look, there's no evidence here. You've given us no evidence that that race played any part in this decision making. And so unless you can actually prove, like point to evidence or to show that race was a consideration, if they say it was just partisan, then we're going to accept that it's partisan. And we've said partisan gerrymandering is okay time and time again. This map that you see here on the screen, all these orange states allow partisan gerrymandering. So we're looking at Oregon, Nevada, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Texas, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Missouri, Illinois. All those states allow political parties to draw those lines. Now, the states that you see that are gray, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Alaska, and Vermont, they only have one congressional district, so it's not like there's any gerrymandering happening there. But then in the white states, California, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Washington, Maine, New York, and I messed up one of them, no, Maine. Those do not allow for partisan gerrymandering. So basically, these particular state governments have come down and said, we're not going to allow partisan gerrymandering to happen within our states. So before we talk about what California does, I want to ask, how mad are you about gerrymandering? How mad does it make you knowing that these politicians get to keep drawing these lines to ensure that their party continues to be elected or that they continue to be elected? And when we look at our government and why we never see lots of change in our government, why it's always the same people in power, is it because this gerrymandering is happening? All right. So here in California, we do not allow gerrymandering. We have what we call the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, and their job is to draw our districts for us. Now, the Redistricting Commission in California has 14 members on it. 5 are going to be Republicans, 5 are going to be Democrats, and 4 are going to be independent candidates. So they get together every 10 years once we get our census numbers, and they interview, during census years, you can go onto their website and they'll ask you your demographics and what makes your neighborhood special to try and determine how we should draw these district lines. And then they draw these district lines for us in a nonpartisan manner so that there's no gerrymandering. There's no one in control being trying to make sure that there are more Republican districts or more Democratic districts. It's all done on a nonpartisan basis. So if we look at what happened here in Whittier, so if you live in Whittier, you can see these are our boundary lines. It includes Montebello, a little bit of Santa Fe Springs, some Norwalk, La Habra, all the way over here to Walnut. These are all considered our district. We're District 38. If we look at our total population of District 38, we have 760,000 people within our district. About 68% of those 760,000 are voting age. Of that, about 56% are Hispanic or Latino. About 2% are African American. 21% are Asian, and about 20% are white. So within our District 38, we see that Latinos make up the largest portion of our district. But if we look at minority versus white voters, we see that minorities far outweigh the number of white voters that we have within